Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. My name is Tamara Pesic. I'm so pleased that you could all come and join us this afternoon. Our guest today is Dr. William Mitchell from MIT, who's written many books that many of you are probably already familiar with, perhaps most famously City of Bits and most recently Me++. We've been having a lovely time here at Microsoft today talking to him about his many areas of expertise, and I'm so pleased that he could come and join us this afternoon. Please help me welcome Bill Mitchell.
Good, thank you. Well, it's always good to be here. There are lots of friends here, so it's always good to be back. I'm fundamentally an architect and urban designer who's been concerned with the ways that information technology intersect with the ways we think about buildings and the use of architectural space and urban space. And that's fundamentally what I'm going to talk to you about today. I've written several books over the last decade now that deal with these issues. And I thought it might be interesting to focus on some dimensions of what I've written today. You know, in the course of several books, you cover a lot of territory, actually, but I'm going to focus on a couple of particular themes, and I'm going to connect it up to what we've been doing in the last few years in rebuilding the MIT campus, because one of the hats I wear at MIT is architectural advisor to the president of MIT, and we've done about $1 billion worth of construction in the last few years. We've completely rebuilt the campus, and what we've done, in many ways, of course, has been informed by the way that the world is changing and the ways that the uses of architectural space begin to change as information technology gets injected into them. So what I'll try and do is sketch out a few general principles that I think are interesting and a little bit surprising in some cases, and then I'll conclude by showing you a little bit of some of the new buildings we've done, which, if you know MIT, are very different from the older buildings at MIT. They don't look like the Infinite Corridor anymore. They look like something quite different. So these are the books I've done in the last few years. I won't belabor it beyond that. Since the MIT Press sponsored me to come here, I've got to show the commercial, so that's done, and we can move on. We can move on from there. So let me start with a question that's very fundamental, and a developer looks at things this way, and an architectural client looks at things this way, and increasingly architects are looking at things this way. If we've got all of this new information technology being deployed everywhere, what does it really do to architecture? And in very practical terms, how can information technology add functionality and value to architectural space and to urban public space? How can it make a room work better? How can it make a building work better? How can it make a city work better? And how can it make public space work better? Well, there are some myths. There was a kind of line that was promulgated over the last decade that said, well, you know, if you have great information technology, that produces the death of distance. Distance no longer matters, and maybe it just enables anything to happen anywhere, anytime. You've heard these sorts of marketing slogans, and they have a certain amount of truth. It's not that these are completely wrong, but it's much more complicated than that. And what I'd like to suggest to you today is that the interactions of information technology and architecture and urban space are subtle and complex. They've evolved over time, and they really need to be understood on two sides. If you're developing the technology, I think it's extremely interesting and important to know how it affects the spaces of buildings and cities. And conversely, of course, if you're an architect or urban designer, you want to know how things are changing, how buildings should respond, how they should be different because of the ways that they're now technologically mediated. Now, it's interesting to look at this, I think, over time, and to put it in the context of a number of stages. So let me go back almost to prehistory, to the, this really is prehistory essentially, this image. It's you know, just to sort of signify the very beginning of the mainframe era and then what went on to become the minicomputer era. And it's interesting to be reminded how really big computers were at this point. I mean, these things were big. These things were essentially buildings, and you can see, you know, walking into it here, walking into memory, I guess, is what's going on there. And they were very delicate. And they required, you know, specialized, you know, fantastically specialized air conditioning systems and you know, very complex installation, tremendous power supply requirements, and of course there were very few of them. One of the architectural indices of scarcity of things is, are they more common or less common than swimming pools? Well, clearly at this point they were less common than swimming pools. So these were scarce things in the early days. Scarce, big, fixed in one location. And the consequence of this was what I like to think of as the village well effect. You know, in a traditional village, the village well is a location, a point of presence of a scarce resource of water. And so you get a spatial pattern where everything centralizes around the village well because you have to be within walking distance of the village well. And then there's a secondary effect, a very important social effect, because everybody has to come to the village well. That's where you meet people. That's where you're seen to be a member of the community. That's where you kind of do deals, conduct business, and that kind of thing. And the early manifestations of information technology had essentially this kind of spatial effect. The digital information and processing capability was available at a very few specialized locations. There was, in a kind of pre-ARPANET, very limited flow of information among locations. There was centralization, very intense centralization of related activities around those locations. So I'm old enough to remember these days, not quite old enough to remember the image that I showed you, but the days in which, you know, you came into the computer center and you worked all night and you worked all day, and there was an intense concentration of talent and expertise, you know, the beginnings of what became hacker culture, focused around that scarce point of presence, just as in an oasis, agriculture and activity and human activity are concentrated around the village well. And so from an architectural point of view, very high value is added to the space surrounding the presence of these scarce resources, and that space becomes a social focus. So that was very much the case in the early days. And many people in this room probably remember the sort of legendary computer labs that developed in these sorts of environments, and the kind of intensity and the way that university campuses were structured with these kinds of digital oases, if you like, becoming the kind of focus. Now, as everybody knows, things began to change with the development of the personal computer, with the development of networking on a large scale, and the spatial pattern became different. So you got a lot of smaller, less specialized points of presence of the technology. That, of course, is the whole point of networking. And I like to show this image because it illustrates both some of the changes that took place and some of the contradictions. This is not a typical work cubicle from this era. This happens to be the little town of Adelaide, South Australia, which is a wonderful civilized city on the Southern Ocean, on the south coast of Australia, and has a terrific Mediterranean climate and, shall we say, a pretty relaxed lifestyle. And this is Rundle Street in Adelaide, which has kind of sidewalk cafes and this kind of thing. And one of the things that happened there was to put network drops and computers out on the cafe tables. And so what you get is interjection of new kinds of activities into environments that hadn't traditionally had them. So it's if you like, it's a lot like introducing piped water supply. So now there are lots of points of access. So you get a situation where digital information and processing capability is available at widely and densely distributed locations. You get free flow of information among locations. You get a situation where the bigger the network becomes, the more valuable it is to the existing participants in the network. I don't know how Bob Metcalfe got his name on that elementary point, but anyway. Value gets added to spaces surrounding points of presence, but these become, as these become commonplace, as happen, the differentiating effect diminishes. So the more you have networks blanketing architectural space, the less difference it makes to actually have connectivity and the capacity to do work. Now, the next thing that came along was the combination of wireless connectivity with miniaturization. And I want to show you several slides here that dramatically illustrate the effect of this. You may recognize this as one of the, I think, most important architectural monuments of the early 20th century. It no longer exists. It's Marconi's transmission station for his first wireless telegraph transmission across the Atlantic Ocean. This is in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. That's what's happened as the cliff has eroded away, and after a while it all fell into the sea. But the point I want to make about this is really big. This thing is really, really big. It's a large piece of industrial architecture in order to blip an electromagnetic disturbance across the Atlantic and send a few bits. So those towers are 400 feet high. There was a spark gap rotor to drive this thing that you could hear for miles. There was a gigantic, power supply building with a big diesel generator in it, and the operators lived in a little house there. And so you can see all of this stuff. So it took a chunk of architecture to give big fixed chunk of architecture to give you wireless connectivity. So that certainly didn't give you mobility at that point. And mobility depended on the combination of wireless technology with increasing miniaturization of the apparatus. So here's an intermediate step down that path. This is about First World War era. So think of this as the precursor of the cell phone, if you like. So it got down to be small enough to get onto a horse, and immediately military applications of this, of course. So beginning to get it starts to give you mobility at this point, and the possibility of nomadic connectivity. And then as that continued, you could start, eventually you'd see the architectural effects. So this is a clipping from the London Guardian 2 or 3 years ago, and it's rather sort of poignant clipping. It shows it shows a person in the foreground making a cell phone call, so mobility there. And then in the background, all of these junk now, these little buildings that used to be characteristic of London, the famous London telephone boxes, which were little shrines to telecommunication. These were places that celebrated the presence of remote connectivity. And what's going on here is this simple but very profound transformation from telephone calls being place to place and the telephone being part of the architecture, literally attached to the architecture, to telephone calls being person to person, and the apparatus becoming an extension of your mobile body rather than part of the architecture. So it's a very simple thing, but a very profound discontinuity that's had all kinds of effects in the ways that we think about architecture and the relationship of technology to architecture. And this has continued, of course, so that you get more and more sophisticated wireless devices, and it's changed the use of space. So the thing that begins to happen, you think about workspace, for example. It used to be that workspace was highly specialized space clustered around the availability of connectivity and information. And now we see this very clearly around the MIT campus. Any place where you can sit down and get a wireless connection becomes an ad hoc workplace. And so this is quite a fundamental shift. So the stage 3, the combination of wireless connectivity with miniaturized portable devices, fills in among the points of presence and creates continuous fields of presence of digital information. You all know the technology. So the presence of digital information and processing capability no longer becomes a distinguishing factor. It no longer distinguishes spaces from each other. And the condition that evolves, and we're really facing this in architecture now, is like electric light or air conditioning. These are not things that differentiate space. This is just a standard sort of commodity in space these days. But they allow the latent potential of spaces to emerge and to generate value. So the electric light, for example, had an enormous effect on cities when it spread and became universally available, because it enabled space to be useful, urban space to be useful in the nighttime, and such a simple thing, but it was a tremendously profound transformation. And air conditioning, a city like Phoenix couldn't develop without the ubiquity of air conditioning. So, and the same kind, we're getting to the same kind of point now where we have to think of wireless connectivity as a sort of architectural commodity that you expect to be part of space. And it goes to a kind of situation where if it's not there, it's like having a building without indoor plumbing or something. It's something that makes a building substandard. Now, the next thing that's happened, and you're all very familiar with this, is as technology has continued to develop and miniaturization has continued. And this is a slide from about a year ago now, I guess. There's more and more functionality has been packed into small portable devices. So the kind of layer of new potential functions that gets added by this universal connectivity gets more and more sophisticated. So with RFID proliferating, location awareness, a whole variety of different kinds of sensors, that greatly strengthens the effect. And as I was saying, space becomes substandard without this sort of capability. Now, the stage that's emerging now, and I just want to briefly touch on this and then move on to some other things, is we see in many, many different contexts, we're moving to a situation where just about everything you might find in a building potentially has some intelligence embedded in it and some capability to be part of a network, and so that the buildings, instead of simply being skeleton and skin that protected you from the weather, and instead of just being skeleton and skin plus kind of mechanical physiologies, which, air conditioning and plumbing and so on, developed in the Industrial Revolution, now essentially buildings start to get nervous systems overlaid on them. And you can begin to think of architecture, you can begin to think of a whole building as something that acts in a coordinated way, all of its systems acting in a coordinated way, because of the interconnectivity and the overlay of a nervous system on it. We're just beginning to understand what this can mean, I think. I put this slide up. It's from the most recent Scientific American, and I don't put it up because I'm convinced by it, but by exactly the opposite reason, actually, that most of the little speech bubbles that I see coming out of here seem to me actually not to be tremendously convincing arguments for this. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that we're moving into an era where you have to fundamentally rethink architecture. I'll show you another example. This is a project recently completed as a joint project of the MIT Media Lab and the Department of Architecture at MIT. And this is a project called Place Lab. And it's just an ordinary apartment in the Central Square area of Cambridge, in an ordinary apartment building, and it's a just, inhabitable place, and people live here. But it's an incredibly densely instrumented space. And basically it has very large numbers of very small sensors scattered throughout the space. These are some renderings. The thing is open in occupancy now. Here you can, in this diagram, you can see just some of the placement. So every cupboard door, refrigerator door, every place you walk, toilet seats, faucets, appliances, everything has sensors embedded in it. So what you get out of this space is an extremely fine-grained and detailed continuous record of the activity that takes place in the space, which raises a lot of interesting technical questions, which you can go into if you like. Then what you can start to do with that stream of information is do behavior recognition on it, which turns out to raise an interesting set of questions too. So the apartment knows whether you're making a cup of tea, and the apartment knows whether you're folding the laundry, and the apartment knows if you're an elderly person whether you fell down and you can't get up. But longer duration things too. So the apartment knows if over 4 or 5 days you're not eating right and you've got into a pattern of not taking care of yourself, and all of these kinds of things. And so now, if you can do that, if you can make an environment that doesn't just sense kind of small fragments of activity, but can really know in some much deeper sense what the inhabitants are doing, then a bunch of really interesting new ways of thinking about functionality, architectural functionality, begin to emerge. So one of the major foci of this space is healthcare for the aging baby boomers. Now, we're not going to solve the problem of healthcare for the aging baby boomers by putting them, actually me, in nursing homes. We don't want to go, and this is not a cost-effective way of doing it either. So there needs to be a solution that allows much more cost-effective and much more graceful provision of health care for the aging baby boomers in situ, in the community. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways to do that is to make these extremely intelligent environments that can do all kinds of health care monitoring and can do all kinds of preventive work. So, if you're not eating right, you get a gentle reminder that maybe you better get a salad out of the refrigerator and eat that salad. And maybe if the pattern of your behavior is worrisome over a few days, maybe what it should do is just gently alert your children, and so on. So this is the kind of thing that's emerging. So it's getting out of the domain of, sort of appliances that are a little bit more efficient, a little bit more smart and responsive, but getting to how can you take an intelligent architectural environment and use it to give a fundamentally different way of dealing with major social issues, and that certainly is a major social issue. And you can think of similar kinds of strategies for thinking about education in the home, and so on. So we're just scratching the surface of this now, I'd say. There's lots of technology around that's relevant, but we haven't had experience with this kind of thing. This has been in operation for about a month, maybe 6 weeks now, and we've had several groups of occupants living in here for a couple of weeks at a time. Generates a couple of hundred gigabytes of data, somebody living here for a couple of weeks. And it's structured data. It's collected in such a way that it's nicely structured and nicely indexed, and you can use it very, very effectively. And all sorts of interesting stuff is coming out of it. One side benefit is architects have never actually had fine-grained data about what happen, what people actually do in the spaces that they design. Now, this might strike you as a shocking thing, but they never have. It's always depended in the past on precedent and on tradition, and it's depended on very crude kinds of studies, walking around with a clipboard and watching what people do for a while and stuff like that. It's really not not very satisfactory. And of course, they're intrusive techniques that change the behaviour you're observing anyway. So there's another side benefit of this kind of thing that I think we'll see much closer understanding by architects of what people actually do when you design something for them. So anyway, this is just to signify that we're moving into an era where you really have to think of buildings now as multiple layers. So the fundamental layer of skeleton and skin, the structural system and the cladding, which is what existed before the before the Industrial Revolution. Then there's the layer of mechanical and electrical systems, which proliferated during the 20th century and became most of the cost of a building. And then there's the layer of what really do begin to look like nervous systems overlaid on all of this now. And you can start to rethink architectural functionality. Or another way to think of it in this context is, you know, if all that computation and communication capacity comes out of the box and really becomes part of the architecture, really goes into the woodwork, then architecture changes really fundamentally. And inhabiting a building becomes identical with interacting with a network and interacting with computational systems, just the everyday act of inhabitation. This is the stage of ubiquitous connectivity where everything has some level of intelligence, sensing capability and connectivity. Maybe everything's a router and participates in, you know, some sort of, you know, all this stuff, maybe some sort of ad hoc network architecture, and intelligence and connectivity become crucial to all types of architectural functionality. Now, the other thing that's happening going along with this is we're starting to see the emergence of environments that have much greater density of, if you like, digitally controlled effectors creating the function of the architecture. So this is a pretty vivid example. This, of course, is Times Square in New York City. And the development strategy for Times Square in the last few years has been to encourage plastering the surfaces with displays. So the surfaces of buildings, instead of just being, if you like, essentially inert static surfaces, become programmable surfaces. And what's happened step by step is they become more and more part of the architecture. So it started out that the programmable surfaces were essentially replacements for billboards, so they're just animated billboards. Then moved to theatre marquees, and then so appropriated that kind of architectural territory. Then on the NASDAQ building, you see here, it really wraps around the entire surface of the wall, and there are windows penetrating through it and so on. And there are some other buildings now, not shown in this picture, where the spandrel panels become programmable and so on. So the surface of the architecture, decoration, information, all of these sorts of things become programmable and potentially responsive. The interesting cultural point about this is nobody knows what to do with this capability. So basically all you're getting in Times Square is a whole lot of zippy visual noise. I mean, the aesthetic is very much the aesthetic of MTV and commercials and animation. And I can't believe anybody actually gets, you know, useful stock information from these scrolling things on 42nd Street. It just seems implausible, absolutely implausible to me. So that's generating a sense of excitement, but there's no cultural depth and there's no cultural understanding yet of how you really make this kind of architecture work. All right, so that's a quick introduction to the way architecture is changing. Let me move on now to talk a bit about some of the second order but really interesting effects that begin to happen at an urban scale and begin to change the way you think about designing buildings. Now, one of these effects is an effect I've called fragmentation and recombination of building types and urban patterns. This is a very interesting one, and you can see this effect really profoundly affecting cities now. To understand this, you need to recognize that adjacency among activities is a very scarce resource. And when you're designing a building, it's rarely possible in buildings and cities to satisfy all the adjacency requirements among activities. So typically what you do, if you're an architect laying out a floor plan, for example, you satisfy the most important requirements for adjacency among activities, and then ones that are less important, you don't quite satisfy so well, and so on. And so you're always making these kinds of trade-offs. So what happens when a telecommunication connectivity weakens traditional spatial and temporal bonds among activities? So, for example, things can happen at a distance. You don't have to be face-to-face, but you can talk over your cell phones and so on. What begins to happen is that latent demands for adjacency, which had always been there but were never effective, begin to become effective, and that produces new kinds of clusterings of activities in buildings and in cities. And you can see this evolving now. Let me give you a very dramatic example of that. And this comes out in the form of the death of a building type, of a traditional building type. You all know that throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the local bank or the local branch bank was a very important building on Main Street, particularly in small communities. And this is a wonderful example. This is one designed by Louis Sullivan in a little Midwestern town around the turn of the century. So these buildings, these bank buildings, not only accommodated the functions of the bank, but they also celebrated the power and the prestige of the institution in the community. I mean, this was an important building. This was part of what was solid. This was part of what was enduring in the community, and so on. If you look at the plan of, and this is the plan of the same building, you can see how the plan is all structured and held together by requirements for adjacency among the activities. So there's a public space in the middle where the public came. And then the tellers were arranged in a ring around there. The transactions literally took place face-to-face, hand-to-hand, across a counter here. So that adjacency is required. Back behind here is the back office. The back office is literally back behind the tellers, and that has to be adjacent because there's a lot of paper goes back and forth here. In order to operate with reasonable efficiency, you need to be able to move the paper back and forth. Then they really kept the money in the vault in those days. This is why bank robbery was such a big thing. So the money was physical stuff. It was bullion, and it was banknotes, and so on. So the vault was really at the center of the plan, accessible from everywhere, and you needed to be able to get to it. So that had to be woven into this web of adjacency. Furthermore, the vault needed to be visible from the front door, so the cop on the beat walking past at night could see whether somebody was busting in. So that was another very tight spatial requirement. And then the president had to have the corner office, which was out on Main Street, where he was visible. It always was he in those days, and could also supervise what was going on in here. And then you had to wrap the whole thing in a security envelope. So if you take all of those adjacency requirements, they're kind of like bonds in a molecular structure holding the atoms of activity together. You end up with this very tight organization that defines the building type. Putting that cluster of activities together makes that building type. Now, you all know the story of what happened over the last few decades. Firstly, automated teller machines came along, and they broke this spatial and temporal bond that took place across the counter here. So you no longer needed face-to-face, and you no longer needed to conduct these transactions in banking hours. So the automated teller machines moved out into the community, firstly onto the front of the bank, and then, into supermarkets and student unions and street corners and gambling casinos and airports and so on. So there's fragmentation and recombination, and these points of access went to locations in the city where people needed cash. So the whole new spatial pattern began to emerge. And then simultaneously, the back office work through e-commerce technology and electronic funds transfer networks and all of these kinds of things, the back office work no longer needed to be near to the customers. So to get economies of scale, the back office activities clustered together in large specialized facilities in particular cities where they even moved offshore. So you got this fragmentation and recombination of this building type. Some of the things decentralized, and simultaneously other aspects of what went on there centralized. Depending on what was driving, what was happening there. So we got the death of a building type. Lots of headlines like this. This again is from the Guardian a year or so ago. It generates an interesting architectural issue. So what do you do with all this valuable real estate on Main Street? My empirical observation of Cambridge, Massachusetts, is they turn into Starbucks. But other things can happen too. But anyway, very vividly, that building type is gone. As a young architect, you used to be able to start a practice doing these kinds of buildings. Well, you can't do that anymore. Literally, it's a building type that's disappeared. Basically, the same thing has happened to the great exchange buildings that were major public buildings, mostly built in the centres of great cities, great American cities and European cities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the great stock exchanges and commodities exchanges and so on. This is one, of course, that emphatically still does exist in Lower Manhattan. But if you go through most European capitals these days, you'll see the old stock exchange buildings, the old Bourse building has been transformed into a museum, or it's been transformed into something else. And it's for the same kind of reason, of course, that a decentralized networked spatial pattern has replaced the kind of concentration on a trading floor that gave rise to these buildings. And then in this town, I don't need to emphasize what happened to book retailing, or many other kinds of retailing too. This is a typical urban, wonderful urban bookstore. This is Shakespeare and Company in Paris, one of the legendary urban bookstores. And see the functions of this building. It carries advertising. It's where you actually store the books. There's a point of sale, which is literally here, where you hand over your cash and you carry the book out. And it's all packaged up in a tight little environment. And there are some contradictions built into this. You'd like a bookstore to have a very large stock, but it's inexpensive urban real estate, so there's a limitation to how much space you can get. So there's always a contradiction between how big it is and whether you can afford to do it and so on. So then along came Amazon, of course, and what happened there was the browsing function and the point of sale function virtualized and moved online. So there was a decentralization there. Those functions could be performed anywhere where you could get network access. The warehousing and supply functions centralized. So you get these enormous, highly automated book warehouses now, not in urban locations, but in inexpensive locations, at major nodes in the national transportation system. So again, a combination of centralization and decentralization. And then all of the enormous back office apparatus that goes on behind this can be just about anywhere in principle. So that goes to locations where the labor force actually wants to be and where there's quality of life and so on. So again, this kind of pattern of fragmentation, recombination. One more example of this, and there are many examples, but I need to move on and talk about a couple of other things. The relationship between the home and the workplace has changed fundamentally. A pattern that developed following the Industrial Revolution was the pattern of the coarse-grained industrial city. And what I mean by that, and actually metropolitan Seattle is a pretty good example of this. So there'd be a downtown central business district, which was essentially commercial, shopping, commercial, office, that sort of activity. Then surrounding that, there'd be a ring of industrial suburbs where there were factories and all sorts of things that made noise and pollution and that kind of thing. And then further out, there'd be the green bedroom suburbs. And morning and evening commute back and forth among these things, very inefficient system. And essentially you got monocultures. So you got the monoculture of suburbia, the residential monoculture, the monoculture of the commercial area, the monoculture of the industrial area. And it was because of the incompatibility of the activities. Now, if you move to a situation where much more of the economy is occupied with information work, and if information work can be supported by portable wireless devices, and if that work doesn't necessarily generate large concentrations of people and large concentrations of noise and pollution and so on, which generally it doesn't, then you can put the home and the workplace back together again in a much more fine-grained kind of combination. So you can go back, in fact, to a pre-industrial pattern of the live-work dwelling in, if you like, the post-industrial era. And that enables some interesting urban patterns, too, because if you put the live-work dwellings together with, if you concentrate live-work dwellings, that gives you a 24-hour population. That enables you to support local services like cafes and dry cleaners and that kind of thing. And you can very effectively start to go back from the pattern of the coarse-grained industrial city back towards the pattern of the urban village, where you get this fine-grained interaction of these different characters. I'll show you one image of this. This is happening in many parts of the world, but this is Singapore, the photo taken about a year ago. And in the background, you see traditional Singapore development, high-rise monoculture, either high-rise office buildings or high-rise apartment buildings. And you usually can't tell the difference, actually. It's very difficult. A few more balconies on the residential buildings. And this is a new development right in the centre of Singapore, where part of the old urban fabric of shop houses has been preserved. And shop houses, of course, were live-work dwellings. Very beautiful, living space upstairs, commercial space downstairs, and a colonnade of public space going across the front. These have been redeveloped, networked, filled with modern technology, and these are now being marketed as the trendiest kind of urban location in Singapore. And you see this in many corners of the world. All right, let me wrap up with a couple more points about this and carry it on to MIT. One other thing that's starting to happen from all of this interaction of technology and new spatial patterns is that new and valuable forms of human interaction are starting to result from the injection of technological capability into face-to-face settings. I want to show you something that's been very dramatic for me over the last couple of years. This is just a classroom at MIT, just a conventional lecture hall at MIT. And the difference, of course, is that students are not taking their notes on pads of paper, but they're taking their notes on their wirelessly connected laptop computers. And this is commonplace through universities these days. Now, what's going on here? Well, they are taking notes. That is one of the things that's happening there. At least some of them are taking notes. They're also developing all kinds of back channels in the class. So they're emailing each other and sending text messages and undoubtedly commenting on the quality of the lecture and doing all kinds of subversive activities. You can think of this in two ways. You can think of this as a challenge to your authority and charisma as a teacher, or you can think of it as a fabulous new layer to the discourse that's taking place in the classroom. And certainly much more interesting to think of it that second way, that these multiple channels. It's much more comforting, too, to think of it that way, these multiple channels. So that's going on. But the other thing that's going on is really, really interesting. And I don't know how many people in this room have had this experience, but the character of a seminar has changed fundamentally in the last couple of years. And it's changed in this way. The moment I mention anything, some student Googles the topic and injects back into the conversation whatever they found as the result. And it's fabulous. It's unbelievably fabulous. Firstly, the students are very good at this. They're not, contrary to some belief, they're not mindlessly web surfing. I mean, they're very smart. They know how to evaluate information on the fly, and they know how to, get what they want quickly, and they can multitask and listen at the same time as they're doing this, and so on. So they do this. It produces a kind of dynamic in the seminar room that's just exhilarating and also exhausting, because you get these, very grounded conversations going on, very intense, very high speed, and it changes the style of teaching. If you're an old-fashioned authoritarian teacher, depending on your superior command of the subject matter for your authority in the classroom, forget it, right? You cannot dominate 20 smart students with Google and the web in that kind of manner. You just cannot teach that way. So you have to figure out strategies for teaching, which are tremendous fun, of essentially surfing the wave of discourse and guiding the wave of discourse and moving it into productive directions and opening up questions and so on. So you have to be able to improvise on a dime. You have to be, you can imagine how you do this. But the point I want to make is that a traditional architectural space, traditional lecture hall here, with just very basic everyday technology introduced into it, begins to behave socially in a completely different kind of way that's absolutely profound. And the sort of thing that's going on here, I would argue, is much more important, much more far-reaching in its effects than a lot of strategies of, formalized educational technology and so on. And the students invented this for themselves, right? This is just a grassroots invention that they did for themselves. And we're seeing lots of this. This is one of the design studios at MIT. This is, those of you who are designers know what design studios are like. They're a big mess. Design studios are always a big mess. And one of the characteristics of a design studio is you create an environment for discourse in which there's all kinds of stuff going on. So this mess, in fact, is a productive mess. So students have stuff pinned up on the walls that's important to them. They have physical models. They're making drawings. They're eating and drinking. They're talking to each other. And what's happened with all of this is that the interjection of the right kind of technology is transforming the way this works. So look at this student here. The student has, among all of this junk on his physical desktop, he has, there's his laptop computer that's supporting, CAD software, and he's got his iPod in his ear, and there's a whole lot of multitasking going on here in this very rich and complex environment. Now, this is different from the way it used to be. Almost 20 years ago now, I wired up the design school at Harvard by putting a network connection on every desk and a desktop computer on every desk. That was a much more rigid sort of environment. What you get here in this new kind of environment that's emerging is the capacity for students to cluster in problem-solving groups around a model or around a device that they might want to work on, to cluster around the coffee and so on. So you get a very dynamic sort of pattern of nomadic appropriation of space and movement around through the space that's intense and powerful and very, very effective, and very different from the old days of having to go to a fixed location in order to get access to the network. We see this kind of thing going on. We see that the cafe tables are highly productive space these days because they double up as workspace and they double up as spaces for problem-solving groups. This drives the bean counters crazy because used to be that in assessing the efficiency of university buildings, you'd compute a net-to-gross ratio, so the net was all the serious stuff like laboratory space and that kind of thing, and the gross was calculated by taking into account circulation space and so-called luxuries like tea areas and coffee areas and that kind of thing. And now it's become clear, and you see our people voting with their feet, that there's less and less demand for the sorts of highly formalized workspace and more demand for the kind of space that you see here. So this gives you very different pattern of what a university building looks like. And I won't belabor this. Some efforts to integrate this into classroom design. Actually, this is interesting. This is a classroom called the Teal classroom. It's an experimental classroom that we set up. So it means it's for teaching beginning physics, freshman physics, and students can check out physics apparatus, and they can group around and and the teacher walks around as a coach and so on. So all the faculty members who are involved with this love it. They think it's absolutely fabulous, and they're evangelists for it. And as far as I can tell, all the students really hate it. It's not clear that this is really the right kind of pattern, but maybe it is. I think they love, actually, they love the sort of chalk talk mechanism that's been so much denigrated. There are some values to that. Anyway, I want to make one more point and wrap this up. The other kind of space where the overlay of technology is changing the way it works. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but this is the sort of thing you see in urban environments now. This is a recent survey my students did of Newbury Street in Boston, the major shopping street in Boston, and just showing the amount of wireless connectivity that exists in Newbury Street. So we're starting to get an overlay of different kinds of functionality on public space there. We've seen some really interesting examples like Bryant Park in New York City, which has really become, right in Midtown, beautiful park, has really become an extension and overflow space for the New York Public Library, simply by adding in wireless connectivity and access to it through the website of the New York Public Library. And that's had all sorts of interesting spatial effects and social effects. A couple of things we observed about this. One was it gives you an ostensible reason to be in the space, that you're working away, and indeed probably you are working. It gives you an excuse to be there so that you can actually socialize and meet people and all of the sorts of things that you want to do in urban space. Kind of the way newspapers used to function in cafes in Europe traditionally, and still do. The other thing is it turns out to be a great place to look for work. And if you think about this, people don't necessarily want to look for a new job in their boss's space, and they don't necessarily want to do it at home either. But this kind of space gives neutral turf in which to do it, and you have the functionality that enables you to perform that activity in the space. And one of my students did a little survey of this and found this was actually a very prevalent kind of pattern. And the other major thing that's happened, and this is really an interesting study in itself, the political use of public space and the way that's increasingly being coordinated by, at multiple levels, by websites, by text messaging, by email, of course, by cell phones and so on. And so I had a whole interesting study that we've gone through of looking at street demonstrations in the last several years and how they've been organized this way. So you know, the functions of public space, the sort of functions that can be supported in public space of political expression are changing. All right, final point. In some ways, this is one of the most surprising things, and I'll call it the paradox of high-tech space with a low-tech look. This begins to emerge if technology becomes really good, begins to disappear into your pocket and disappear into the woodwork, so it no longer dominates architectural settings. And this creates an enormous architectural opportunity. It creates an opportunity for architects to go back to designing spaces around the very basic needs of people rather than the requirements of technological systems. And so the result is an architecture of light and air and view and sociability. Now, this is a very striking thing. I'll give you one example. There are many examples, but traditionally, for example, presentation spaces, like this presentation space, have been darkened spaces. They've been that way for 100 years. Now, why is that? Well, because they need audiovisual equipment, and the audiovisual equipment that's existed for the last 100 years or so required darkened spaces. So whole disciplines are done in the dark. The whole discipline of art history is done in the dark. The whole discipline of teaching introductory architecture is done in the dark. People go to sleep after lunch. You know, there are all kinds of pathologies of this kind of thing. Well, of course, what has happened now is that with new and high-intensity video projectors, and certainly with large displays, you don't have to do it in the dark anymore. So a very elementary thing is beginning to happen. You can make auditorium and meeting room spaces that have natural light and natural air, and that changes the dynamic absolutely fundamentally. So all of the new lecture theatres we've been doing at MIT have daylight, sunlight coming into the lecture theatres. So that's one example of how when the technology gets good, the technology no longer has to dominate the architecture. Similar thing is these little, the computers that you all carry around don't really need specialized environmental conditions. They don't need to operate in air-conditioned environments, so you can open the windows, you can go out and use them under a tree on a sunny day, and so on. So this is tremendous new architectural freedom and a kind of paradox that the better the technology is, the less of it you see and the less of it that dominates the architecture. So this is a very striking example. I gave a couple of talks a few weeks ago at the Queensland Institute of Technology in Brisbane, Australia, and they asked me to talk about the classroom of the future, and I said, look, you already have it. You're adjacent to the Brisbane Botanical Gardens, which is this magnificent subtropical paradise with you know, banyan trees and Moreton Bay figs and magnificent birds and so on, and there's little structures like this that just provide shelter from the sun and the rain, skeleton and skin, and this is right adjacent to the campus, so the students wander out there and exist in this kind of environment. what's happening here is this student is working away, wirelessly connected on her laptop in this environment. So what you're ending up here is a simple and exquisitely beautiful kind of architectural environment, not dominated by the technology, but in fact highly serviced by the technology. And you get this kind of space usage beginning to develop. So, take a couple of minutes. I'll show you the building we've done recently at MIT. So here's one of them. It's a building by Stephen Hall. It's one of the newest dormitory buildings at MIT, and it's not unlike the sort of liberal arts college up the river. This is not a red brick a Georgian box with ivy on it. It's something quite different. And it's a reinvention of the urban dormitory form, and I have a lot of things to say about this. But I want to point out a particular thing about it. It's a very striking building form. It has the basic organization is pretty straightforward: double-loaded corridor organization, dormitory rooms. But if you look at a section of this building, well, so you look at the facade, you see all the windows are operable windows. And that's in keeping with this business of being able to go back to a more natural environment when the technology gets to be good enough. Now, here's a section of the building, and you see going up through the building are these kind of free-form, amazing free-form spaces that are very deliberately the kind of multifunctional, flexible, appropriatable space that I mentioned before. So these function as circulation, taking you through the building. They function as party spaces. They function as problem-solving spaces. They all have whiteboards, and you go in and you see, theorems being derived and all kinds of stuff happening on the whiteboards. And they're just places where you can sit down and work, or you can work on a problem set, and so on. And so you can start to see the interjection of a new kind of space in a very literal kind of way. Bob Campbell, the architecture critic of the Boston Globe, called them very nicely smoke signals rising up through the building. This is just one of those spaces in use at night, and you get some sense of socially how these things work. Then our most recent major building. This is the new Stater Center for Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and CSAIL, a major lab, and LIDS, and linguistics and philosophy, and a whole major constellation of activities. It's a very large laboratory building. It's about 400,000 square feet of laboratory space and about 700 cars parked underneath it. So it's a very major thing. It introduces into the MIT context some exciting new things, like a childcare center. Imagine a childcare center in a laboratory at MIT. Well, it actually has it. Cafeterias, health club, it's just very different for MIT. But I want to show you the plan of this. Well, there it is in construction. So it's constructed in occupancy now, and that's the kind of. It's a Frank Gehry building. It's it's pretty wild in its form. But what I want to show you here is this is the ground floor plan, and the turquoise area running through here is a reinvention of MIT's famous infinite corridor. Now, it's not the same shape as the infinite corridor elsewhere in the campus. There are lots of nooks and crannies and places to hang out and so on. And this is deliberately put together so it functions as an indoor street with a huge amount of space that you could say, well, maybe that's waste space, but in fact it's social space and space that can be appropriated for a lot of different purposes. Major public functions like major auditoriums are on the space. The childcare center is on the space. The cafeteria is on the space. And in all of these little nooks and crannies, there are places that you can just appropriate for any purpose that might seem useful at the time. And to wrap up, I'm going to show you two slides of the building now in occupancy. So this is part of the, just on a sunny day, actually 4 or 5 days ago, you can see these are some typical spaces in the indoor street, and you can see how. I would never have thought these things have worked. These are literally slabs of plywood, and they're incredibly popular and used in the kind of way that you see here all the time. So these are very, very important work and problem solving and social space. And then I go back to here. There's an exterior space here. is a kind of form of a kind of Greek theatre, named after Mike Detouzis. I mean, some of you may know Mike Detouzis, and this is named after Mike. I walked past there on a sunny day several days ago, and it's functioning exactly as we intended it. So the environmental qualities of this space turn out to, as intended, an enormous attractor because it's, you know, it's beautiful, it's sunny, it's a social focus. So, you know, concentration of people attracts still more people, and you get this kind of thing going. If you look carefully at this picture, you see sort of distinguished faculty members and freshmen and staff and all kinds of things. And if you look even more closely, you'll see there's a combination of eating and working, and a significant percentage of the people who are occupying that space are in fact connected. They're wirelessly connected and participating in a high-tech networked environment. So that's the final piece that strikes me as very important. So there's a very quick survey through what's happening to architecture as a result of the interjection of digital technology and what's happening on a larger scale to urban form. It's not, as you might think from an initial superficial consideration, the emergence of highly technology-dominated sort of environments of the future. But we're seeing new spatial patterns, new social patterns emerging within those spatial patterns, and new kinds of architectural qualities that go back to the fundamental basics of architecture. So something that's very exciting, and you can see it, I think, very clearly in the new buildings we've done recently on the MIT campus. So thank you.